we want to get more into some of the positions looking ahead for this Alabama team. And today what we figured we would do is look more on the defensive side of the ball and in that secondary, where at last check or at last notice in that national championship game, things obviously didn't go exactly swimmingly for Alabama on the back end of that group. When you look at what Trevor Lawrence and Clemson was able to do in the national championship game. So we've got some questions for Alabama corners that we'll look at. We'll talk safeties too as we move further into the offseason. But it's interesting because going into this season, something different that we're going to see is a dedicated position coach in place. With Charles Kelly coming on to coach the safeties and sort of co-defensive coordinator role with Golding, Pete Golding there on the defensive side of the ball. You've got Carl Scott now working with the corners, which led you to wonder going into the spring how much time we might see Nick Saban with those guys still. Nick Saban, he likes to work with those corners. He likes to be with that secondary, especially early in practices during those individual drills. And our answer that we got in the spring is even with that balky right hip, Saban was still with Carl Scott and Charles Kelly back there with those DBs. So I don't think it's going to limit Nick Saban all that much in terms of a dedicated assistant, even with the hip procedure he's coming off of. And the play of that group, I thought, gave Alabama fans reason to be encouraged looking ahead to the season, how they performed during spring drills. As we know, we all got a closer look at that group. In the 8A game, Trayvon Diggs looked healthy. Patrick Surtain looked really good, a guy that they're more and more comfortable with, it appears, as far as moving around in that secondary. He was exclusively a corner as a true freshman last year. Well, in the spring game this year, we saw him at the star position with the first-team defense throughout that scrimmage. So between Diggs, you've got Surtain coming along. You've got Josh Jobe emerging as a third corner potentially in his second year in the program. All those things bode well for this Alabama defense moving forward. And so when you talk about the different structure in place with the dedicated coach for the corners and the safeties, I'd say so far, so good. And speaking of Josh Jobe, a question we had for him was, is he ready to take over a role of significance in the secondary? The last time we saw Josh Jobe, he replaced Savion Smith at left corner in that national championship game against Clemson. Savion went down on the big touchdown play that essentially iced the game. And, Jobe took a few lumps while he was in there against Clemson, but I thought he competed extremely well. And so we sort of expected Josh Jobe to be that third corner in the spring, and it certainly played out that way. In the 8A game, he had a scrimmage high 3 pass breakups. And what you liked as much as anything from Josh Jobe was this is a guy that played with some edge in that scrimmage. He had the personal foul call, I guess the unnecessary roughness call on a very physical tackle of Devontae Smith, you might recall, in that scrimmage. And you also had another young corner, another second-year corner coming off an injury, in Jalen Armour-Davis that did some nice things in that scrimmage as well. He gave up I think a pass interference call, but even on that play, he showed some nice recovery skills. And again, coming off that ACL, you figure Armour-Davis with a full summer of continued rehab and strength and conditioning, he could solidify a spot on that 2-deep for the 2019 season. So you like those second-year corners, both Josh Jabes and Jalen Armour-Davis. Another question for the corner/star position is tied into Shyheim Carter. Will he continue in his role at the star position? He was the guy. There's no doubt about it, especially after Trayvon Diggs went down with that foot injury against Arkansas in October of last season, early October. At that point, Shyheim Carter exclusively became the star guy in the nickel and dime position, in nickel and dime packages. Prior to that, we'd seen him work at safety in the dime and star in the nickel. Well, he became a full-time star after that injury to Diggs. Now, Carter in the offseason, prior to spring drills, underwent sports hernia surgery. So he was in a black non-contact jersey throughout the spring. You did see him on the field, though, in the 8A game. He wasn't tackling. He was basically tagging people out there. So we'll see between safety, because you are looking for a legitimate candidate to go along with Xavier McKinney back there with Deontay Thompson entering the NFL draft, going in the 5th round, as we know now. So Carter is in the mix, I think, still for that safety position. But at a minimum, you have to think he's going to have a role in some of these sub packages somewhere. He could be the co-starter at safety. He could be the third safety. When you get into your dime package, he could be a starter at star. He could be a situational star defender. The point being that this guy is what you could essentially call a Band-Aid back in the defensive secondary. So wherever Alabama needs to cover most for injuries and or subpar play, that's where you're most likely to see Xavier McKinney. We also asked, Shyheim Carter. We also asked the question, what's next for Patrick Surtain heading into 2019 spring drills? Was he going to be more like a Marlon Humphrey? Marlon Humphrey was one of those corners under Nick Saban that you really never saw at the star position. He was exclusively outside, kind of a lockdown guy, the prototype corner. Was that going to be the case for Patrick Surtain, or were we going to see him maybe mix in at the star position? You got to be careful in the spring, because that's a time where just about everybody, if you're a corner or even a safety, some of the safeties, you're probably going to work at the star position. So we did see Patrick Surtain at star and corner, but it was a little bit surprising that he played almost exclusively at the nickel corner spot, the slot corner spot in the spring game, instead of Trayvon Diggs. You sort of thought, well, Trayvon's healthy. Trayvon did it last season before the injury, so you kind of anticipated that he would do it again, or maybe even Shyheim Carter, even in that non-contact status, might be with the ones at the slot corner. It didn't play out that way. It was Patrick Surtain. So that the toolbox, I guess you could say, maybe adding another piece for Patrick Surtain at that star position. Our final question going into spring drills at the cornerback position: is Trayvon Diggs ready to take another step? It's kind of been hit and miss for him. He bounced around a little bit early in his career at Alabama from a positional standpoint. You saw him on offense, you saw him on defense, you saw him on both early on. And it's easy to understand why a coaching staff would do that with a guy like this, more so because of the measurables. This is a guy that's 6'2", 200 pounds. He's likely to run sub 4.5 when he gets to, the combine aspect of the NFL draft process. He possesses every physical attribute you would like in both a corner, a star defender, or even on the offensive side of the ball at the wide receiver spot. He looks like all of those guys. He looks like an NFL corner right now. He really does, because of those measurables that we talked about. You can go around the National Football League and try to find a guy with those type of measurables that impresses you more than Trayvon Diggs, and you'd be hard-pressed to find all that many. Jalen Ramsey is a guy that comes to mind. When I look at Trayvon Diggs, just in terms of his size and his length, Jalen Ramsey of the Jacksonville Jaguars is a guy that comes to mind pretty quickly. Now, that's not to say Trayvon Diggs is going to be Jalen Ramsey, but in terms of checking those boxes physically, that's what Trayvon Diggs does for you from that standpoint. So, more of the question about how would the foot hold up in the spring, that looked to be no problem. And even more importantly than that, his confidence in it didn't seem to be an issue. It didn't appear as if Trayvon Diggs was tentative out there. So, again, barring a setback, it's difficult to envision a scenario where Trayvon Diggs doesn't perform well enough to become Alabama's next early round selection at corner/star, those sort of multi-roles that the NFL cherishes so much from those corner types at the next level. So there you go. 5 off-season questions that we sort of revisited for the cornerback position for the Crimson Tide ahead of the 2019 season.